So thanks, Rosie. I'm a Hawthorn supporter, so I like being a hawk. So before I start, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we stand in across all of Australia and to recognise the tens of thousands of years of stewardship that traditional owners have had on the land. I also wanted to recognise that that land has never been ceded. So I've worked in the policy space and the advocacy space for about 20 years, and it's pretty dry. I've found it pretty hard going as a conservation scientist. But one of the best things I've ever done is actually help set up this group called the Research and Recovery of Endangered Species. The reason I want to talk about this is that it's really inspiring to get students and staff out working on threatened species individually with different land managers, including Indigenous mobs, defence land managers, miners, farmers around the country working on specific species needs and just trying to get outcomes, day-to-day outcomes for species. This for me has been probably the most rewarding stuff I've ever done in my career, and it's something that is going to help frame this talk. Now, we set up RES about 10 years ago, and as a bird watcher, I was really trying to focus on those birds that I thought needed the most attention. Now, what happened when we started diving into some of these bird species is that every time we looked at a species we wanted to study and started to examine it in detail, we realised we were getting the basic information wrong. Even basic listings of these kind of charismatic, well-known species were just wrong. So night parrots, probably one of the most famous birds in Australia. If you looked at the information around it, it was every time we dived into it, did the actual hardcore study, the information was actually incorrect. And for the 10 species we've studied, 7 of them have basically got their listings wrong, and what threatens them, the information, if you looked at the conservation advices and the action plans, they just were simply incorrect. And it's got me thinking as a scientist, how bad is this problem and how well do we communicate it? Now, one piece of work we did was just to dive into the action plan of Australian birds, which is, if people know this, is a big tome of every threatened species. And it's a beautiful book, 3 or 4 pages per species, explaining what we know about the species and what we're meant to, and what are the things we need to do to save the species. But in that book is this categorisation of how much knowledge do we really know, and it's around low, medium, and high levels of certainty. And if you just characterise the numbers across all these species, when you start to see a picture emerging that many species, we have still very low certainty around what's actually going on with them. And it's not just the least concern category where we may not be interested in it, it's across all extinction risk categories. So to think that, a large proportion of the critically endangered species, those species that need urgent attention, we still don't know really what we have to do to save them, is pretty mind-boggling. And it's something that I think as conservationists we probably need to talk about a bit more, about what we actually know to save species. And as I stand here, I'm talking about birds. And I know there's people, Kate would be looking on this, Janice would be looking at this going, would you stop talking about birds? But, birds are really well known, and those levels of certainty are really low. Our levels of knowledge around other taxonomic groups are non-existent in many places, and this really does hamper how we do conservation. So one thing I would like to talk about in this broad session of science, policy and practice is maybe as a scientist we need to communicate the degree of uncertainty we have in facing species a bit more. Because I notice when you go into the policy world, we don't talk about it enough, and we give a degree of confidence around how things are going and what needs to be done when we really are blindly guessing. And that is influencing how we do conservation. So I've mentioned the issue with federal listings and state listings, that every time I've dived into a species, there's been a real problem in terms of what actually the species is in terms of this level of endangerment. Recovery planning, if you look at recovery planning advices and conservation advices, if you dive into that information, you realise that it's actually not much there. It's actually like an eggshell that you tap on it and it just empties out to nothing. It's not the faults of the bureaucrats or the people in government. It's just that they're doing their best they can with the experts there, but there's actually not enough information just to guide guide activities. Now, with this emergence of regional planning, I've been involved with that in several states, and again, this level of certainty around species and what is an irreplaceable area and what's an avoidance zone, we never talk about our certainty around this stuff, which obviously has a real implications about where you put protected areas, where you put avoidance zones. Protected area planning, I've done a lot of that in my time. again, we just don't mention uncertainty in many cases, and therefore we plan on what we know or we think we know, and then just go ahead and get these protected areas. But again, we don't get to the stage of actually talking about, well, how certain are these protected areas in the places we are? And offset assessment, frankly, if you're uncertain around a species, it's just ignored in many, many processes. A lot of these data deficient species, it goes in a too hard basket, which I think is something that, if we're thinking about on-ground recovery of species, is a major problem. So one potential solution is just simply characterising the different forms of knowledge, data information deficiency that we have for threatened species. And a few of us has come up with this concept called the conservation research ladder. Now, I'll go through this in a second, but it's a ladder in that every species has to walk up the ladder to get to the top. It's like, they've got to go up each rung. And it's based on a really basic, simple premise that to start, to do any conservation, you need to know where the species are. If you don't know where the species is, how on earth are you going to do species-specific conservation action in the wild? And so some species, we still don't know where the actual locations are in the wild, like buff-breasted button quail. So this is a species that's stuck on the bottom rung of the ladder. But some species, we know where they are, we just don't know what threatens them. Red goshawks, one of the most charismatic raptors we have in Australia, has lost a third of its range in the last 20 years, and we have no idea why. And so, so this is a species that we know where it is, but we just don't know what threatens it. So it's stuck on this second part of the ladder, going, actually, we need to actually, understand more about the threats. Night parrots, my favourite bird, is, in my mind, stuck on this third rung of the ladder, and that we now have got a good idea of locations through fantastic work with Indigenous rangers across the country. We're getting a really good handle on that. We now know the threats. We know cats are a problem. We know fire is a problem. But the management of these threats, especially cats in the wild, is still a real massive knowledge gap that we haven't actually overcome. So this is a species that we know where the species is, we know the threats, but we don't know how to manage that in the locations they occur. So some species we know the locations, the threats, and the management, but what we got to better understand is management happening? It's the implementation gap. And so this is the fourth rung of the ladder, and this is a northern masked owl, where again, research done by Western science and Indigenous scientists have really unpacked what the problem with this species is, especially in northwest and Western Australia. But these species we understand all the knowledge, but we don't know if the implementation is happening. Therefore, is this species on a trajectory of declining or not? So this species, the northern masked owl, is captured on this rung of the ladder. A good example of a species that has the location known, the threats are known, the management actions are known, and also the management's happening, but there's insufficient monitoring of those species population. The fifth rung of the ladder is a herald petrel, which is found on the Great Barrier Reef. So it's got a lot of knowledge, but we just don't know if the species are responding to the actions that have been undertaken to actually save that species. So that's a monitoring shortfall. So that's the fifth rung of the ladder. And the last rung on the ladder are the species which have all the ingredients we have, the knowledge ingredients to ensure conservation success. So the Norfolk Island parakeet is a good example of this. We know the locations, we know what threatens it, we know the management strategies to overcome it, we know that implementation is happening, and we are monitoring that implementation. So that species is at the top of the ladder. It's got all the knowledge information you need to safeguard that species to get through the hurdles of actually making it go extinct. The reason why I think this is quite important is that you can start looking at threatened species in two ways. You can look at the extinction risk, which is how the level of endangerment and how long it's got to go before it goes extinct, and how much knowledge we have. So if you're a buff-breasted button quail, you're in a very different trajectory to a Norfolk Island parakeet, even though both species is critically endangered. It gives you another dimension of the knowledge that we need to actually understand for this species, which I think can tell us what different opportunities are to safeguard these species. It also helps us simply to frame the challenges of what we need to do to safeguard the species. So, if the species is not known, the location is not known, well, we have to go find them. If we don't know the threats, we have to do research on why this thing's threatened. With management, like you've got to start understand, the management shortfall, well, we've got to actually start undertaking trials to actually understand the management. Implementation, well, this is the big one, I think, is like, do we know if implementation, why is implementation not happening? Why are we not actually doing the things that we know we have to do? And that's more of a social science question, a societal question. And I think things like James will be talking about later is that we need to actually understand what the shortfalls are in getting things going. So again, it's a way to actually help frame these challenges. Now, these two methods aren't in competition; they're actually aligned. You can actually do extinction risk assessments and knowledge data assessments and give you a full picture. So this is the picture of Australian birds. If you look at these shortfalls and showcase, critically endangered species, the level of number of species captured across these rungs of the ladder. And you can see the spectrum of the challenge we need to actually tackle. So it's another way of communicating the shortfalls, I think. So thanks for listening. I'd love any feedback on this. I'm also happy to share these slides. This paper's been going to be written up for peer review, but it's at the stage of just, if you think I'm wrong or you think there's things to add to it, I'd love to hear about it. But thanks for the opportunity.